Okay, hey, hi everyone. Thanks all for joining. Thanks for the organizers for having me. I want to talk a bit about semantics of staking, fun and games, and balance sheets with staking token. Ooh, yeah. So a bit of context. I've been thinking about the different ways that the Ethereum protocol sees and doesn't see the activity that happens outside of it. I've gone on a few rants about the building network. I've talked a bit about EigenLayer as well, some stuff about rollups. Today I want to focus on the part that's at the bottom, which is liquid staking and EigenLayer. So still going on and observing the different ways that this infrastructure ties with the protocol and changes the incentives for their participants. But when I started looking at these problems, what I realized is that I didn't really have a good way of thinking about these things. And the more I was looking at them, the more the constructions were getting complicated. And so what I really wanted to have is a language that might appear a bit complicated at first, but I believe is worth it to understand the principal agent problems that are at play in liquid staking and restaking. So principal agent problems, I mean that problems where somebody is doing something on someone else's behalf and might not have the same incentives, and that can cause misalignment, and we don't like misalignment. So principal agent problems matter because when you have these principal agent relationships, what's at stake doesn't necessarily translate to what's really at stake for the person that you care about. So when I delegate my stake, someone else is doing the work on my behalf, I might want to care about this. And so for me, drawing out the relationships is pretty complicated because you have permissionless systems, so it means that anybody can innovate any new mechanism, essentially. And so finding a way of communicating these different constructions and sort of teasing out the relationships between the entities that compose them, I thought was something that was valuable. So I'm presenting today work in progress. We are going to release it in a few weeks, I think. But yeah, I hope this is useful, and I'll try to convince you that it is. So starting with the idea of liquefaction or liquefying assets and position, I'm going to say simple things and it's going to look a bit complex, but I hope this is worth it. So let's talk about the original act that the protocol wants, so staking. So the protocol wants you to put your coins at stake to validate the Ethereum protocol. When you do this, I'm picturing it in the balance sheet below, what you get from the protocol is some kind of claim over the principal that you put at stake, but also over the yield that you will receive from your operations. So the better you validate, the more yield you're getting. This here can be represented in the following balance sheet. So I'm doing mainly in this balance sheet two simple operations. The first one is a transfer of asset. So here the solo staker simply transfer their ETH back to the protocol that minted it in the first place. And the protocol gives a claim to the solo staker to say, I received your ETH, and the claim entitles you to withdraw it back from me in a later time. Modulo, of course, slashings, and rewards and penalties. So this is the simplest case that we have, a solo staker putting their assets at stake in the protocol. What we're seeing, of course, is that the SOIF owner, so the person who owns this SOIF asset, is the agent of the protocol. So the protocol is the principal who wants to get motivated agents to validate and to honestly keep building the chain. And so in this case of solo staking, the performance of a solo staker directly aligns with the goals of the protocol. So we have alignment, which of course can be complicated by the other relationships I was showing before, such as block builders. But at least from this perspective, the solo staker payoff here is directly correlated with what the protocol does to evaluate their performance. So this gets a little more complicated when you introduce staking service providers, or SSPs. Not everyone can or wants to solo stake. First, you need 32 ETH to put into the protocol. Then you need also to run the operations yourself. And so what happens is services called SSPs started to open to validate on your behalf. So they're really agents of the stakers who delegate assets to them to delegate into the protocol. And so now the balance sheet starts growing. So we still have at the bottom the row that shows some asset being placed into the protocol. But now what the delegator gets for providing the ETH to the staking service provider is a claim that I call NO-ETH, for node operator ETH, that entitles them to receive back from the staking service provider the assets that they gave them to stake on their behalf. What comes next, of course, is the idea of liquefying these assets. So I was oftentimes, this NO-ETH asset is actually written out on chain. So when you delegate your assets to the SSP, what you're getting out from the SSP is a liquid asset that allows you to keep performing operations on chain. And so you can chain these things together. So when the claim is made fungible by the SSP and transferable to other people who want to hold the liquid asset, we get this, what I call L.NO-ETH, which represents a liquid position of the assets staked by the SSP on behalf of these delegators or these capital providers. And the balance sheet keeps growing. So now we have more steps. I want you to think here of the SSP as sort of a protocol that sits between delegators who provide the assets and node operators who are staking or performing the validation services on behalf of the delegators. I'm mostly showing the balance sheet at this point to tell you that I think this is well posed, but I'm not going into the details. Hopefully the post will go more into this. So one thing that I think is nice when you start drawing out this balance sheet is that from the perspective of the Ethereum protocol, all of the things that happen to the left of the last balance sheet is somewhat invisible. So the protocol doesn't really know that all of this is going on. It just knows that some stake is coming into its system. And so legitimately it can ask, who has my best interest? Like, are my interests as a protocol to be secure and to keep chugging along somewhat defended by this infrastructure that grows outside of me? And so here maybe a way of deciding whether the SSP does a good job or a bad job is to ask ourselves, what do we want out of our SSPs as holders of the liquid assets that they mint? So we want first to incentivize good operator performance, right? We want the node operators who stake on our behalf to do a good job at staking. So the rewards are liquefied, the operators receive a fee for their services, and the fee incentivizes their good performance. So that's one way to realign the incentives of the node operators and the delegators. The second thing that we want is we want to discourage malicious operators. So we want them to be solvent, essentially. And one reason why we might be worried is that the operator here, they have leverage. So they can do more than X dollar worth of damage with less than X dollars of their own assets. They get assets delegated to them. That gives them leverage. And so the solutions here, they come in two flavors, as I saw. The first one is to reduce the leverage as much as possible, and the second one is to bind the operators to prevent them from doing things that might be malicious. So I'll talk about the first type of solution, which is to reduce the leverage. The problem here is that when we have untrusted validators or untrusted node operators that have infinite leverage, it's basically a recipe for disaster. I can't just give my assets to anyone and expect them to do a good job, because then malicious players will come in, pretend to be good, and take my assets and attack the chain with it. And so the idea here, it's something that Rocket Pool uses, for instance, but many others, is to make the operators put their own funds at stake. So essentially reducing the leverage they have to carry out these attacks. The downside, of course, is capital efficiency. Now you must find 1 or 1/3 operator ETH for each unit of delegator ETH that your protocol receives. 1/3 because Rocket Pool allows 8 ETH pools now. Another idea to reduce the leverage is to bind the operators or bind the things that they can do with the stake that they are given. So this is an example that Diva uses. It's the idea of each node operator doesn't control immediately the thing that stakes on the Ethereum protocol. So each node operator controls a part of a virtual validator that is itself governed by DVT, so decentralized validator technologies. The larger you have a set of DVT participants, the more secure, since you need to corrupt the whole set to get the virtual validator to do slashable things. But it also means you have more operator if versus delegator if, so you lose a bit in capital efficiency. So there's a bit of a trade-off here. And so again, here you can see the DIVA protocol sits in between this infrastructure and is the one that mints the LST called DVIF. So the takeaways here is all of what these staking service providers do is this protocol. So they want to guarantee the value of a liquid asset that they mint, and they do that with a combination of hardware, in some cases, incentives, and governance. And so this asset that I call L.NoETH is a liquid claim on node operator, capital, and yields received from the holders. Okay, so far it should be pretty simple things that we've observed in the wild and in this industry quite widely. Yeah, so I'll just move along. Okay, so section 2. A different way that people might start messing around with the incentives of the core protocol, which is restaking. And so switching gears a bit, we introduced the second building blocks in our library of primitives, which is restaking. So it was made famous by Eigenlayer, and the principle is that based on the stake I have in the Ethereum protocol, I want to encumber my stake with additional slashing conditions. So I want to say this thing that I have at stake in Ethereum, I want to put it at stake in this other protocol too. This is nice, in my opinion. It makes the capital more useful. It de-silos the capital. And you can also get this permissionless out of protocol commitments. I like these a lot. But also, it builds more risk into the system, which then must be managed. And to me, the first step to management is to try and understand the risk by drawing out the relationships. And so I show here the basic restaking pattern. So I have a solo staker here who places their ETH under the Ethereum protocol. So they receive this SOETH claim to their capital and yields. And then they put their SOETH into an eigenpod. So an eigenpod is just a smart contract that keeps track of the commitments that you enter into via Eigenlayer. So they do that by setting their withdrawal address to the eigenpod smart contract. And when they do that, they receive this bracket or boxed SOETH asset that they can use to then put back into different protocols, so to restake under these protocols. So what do you do with that? You use this bracket SOETH asset for actively validated services, or AVSs. So the participation has value for the AVS. The AVS wants more stake or demands more stake to back its service. And so against receiving that stake, the AVS will give revenue to the restaker. And I write that claim as AVS.bracket SOETH. It gets longer as we go along, but again, I think the investment is worth it. And yeah, you can really draw out the sequence of balance sheet and convince yourself that this is what actually happens. So there's a bit of misalignment here. Once again, the Ethereum protocol is blind to this bracket SOETH. It's not an asset that it knows about. Suppose the solo staker is slashed on Eigenlayer, then what? Do we not tell the Ethereum protocol? I think it would be bad. It would misalign what the protocol thinks is actually at stake. And for that, we have a solution, which is to report Eigenlayer slashing via execution layer triggered withdrawals, or EIP 7002. So I think this problem is fairly easy to fix. But what's more important to consider is this idea of infinite restaking. So the point of restaking is that based on the same stake, you can keep adding these new slashing conditions and you can keep opting into new AVSs. So the balance sheet gets a bit weird. What I want you to focus on is this red rectangle, which is essentially the eigenpod keeps allowing me to get new liabilities from it. So I can keep getting these bracket X assets and I can keep using them into different AVSs. And essentially, I'm just printing liabilities and potentially over-leveraging myself. So there's a question here that I think is interesting. The first one is on claim hierarchy. So when I restake once, I get this bracket x1. When I restake a second time, I get bracket x2. Are these the same assets? If there is a hierarchy of claim between the AVSs, if I fail on multiple AVSs at the same time, what happens then? Which one has claim priority or claim seniority? This is not so relevant if the assets that are backing this are burnt, but I think this question might be important. And something we might observe too is that when I restake to provide services under these AVSs, I might not be the person who's providing the service. I might delegate the provision of that service to an AVS operator that executes the service on my behalf. So I become only a simple capital provider to the AVS. And once again, you can write this out, and it becomes pretty tricky. And so, yeah, we want to keep going, right? So I've introduced liquid staking, I've introduced restaking. All of this is, again, permissionless. What can we build based on these two primitives? And it starts getting pretty hairy. And so I really think we need a map to understand these things. So the first one is an SSP restaking. So a liquid position based on a liquid service provider or a liquid staking provider, restaking the capital that they obtain from the delegators. And so the node operators of the SSP here, they simply restake the assets that they received from the delegators. And so now the liquid token that I hold, the LST, is not only a claim on the rewards from the Ethereum protocol, but also a claim on all the revenue from the AVSs that the node operators have opted into. I denote that as L.bracket node operator if. A kind of flip side asset is the idea of restaked LST. So EigenLayer now allows you to put at stake not the stake that you have in Ethereum, but just simple LSTs that you own. So if you think about it, the idea of restaking is more general than just using your Ethereum stake for them. You can restake any kind of asset and get these liabilities out of it. So why not LSTs in particular? So what the LST holder does is they give their LST to this eigenpod and they start signing up for AVSs. And here I assume that the AVS operations are done by another party, since the LST holder is assumed to be somewhat unsophisticated, or at least unwilling to run node operations. Another interesting one that we can think about with this pattern, if I can restake an LST, why can't I just restake straight ETH, like raw ETH that isn't coming from any kind of provider, but just the protocol ETH? Actually, this construction looks a lot like SO ETH, so the staked ETH. It's exactly the same if the chain Y that I secure here with my restaked assets is the Ethereum protocol. So you can think of staking for the Ethereum protocol is like adding to yourself the slashing condition that you should validate in the way that the Ethereum protocol wants you to. I think this construction is important for raw ETH to accrue yield as well, and notably important when we have a large set of raw ETH holder versus LST holders. This is also an argument that Anders made in his very long tweet thread, which I encourage you to read it if you haven't seen it yet. Okay, the last one I want to show is a liquid basket of AVSs. So now I'm liquefying a position that is composed of many AVSs entered into with LSTs, okay? So this is where I think the complexity of having this weird notation start becoming helpful, because we can really generate different IDs and talk about them precisely and evaluate them based on this chain of claims that the balance sheet made somewhat clear. And so here the idea is that an aggregator receives LSTs from various holders, and the aggregator becomes responsible for curating a selection of AVSs that the LSTs sort of defend, and then liquefies that position. So that position can now be held by other holders. So this is, I think, a construction that we will see more. I was at a talk by Tarun yesterday, who was mentioning that such baskets of AVSs may be helpful because they help you diversify risk. And so in terms of risk management, I think this is something that makes a lot of sense. That's it. We can't wait to see what you cook up, unironically. I think there's a lot more that we can explore with these constructions. There'll be some posts coming out soon to provide more details. One thing that I haven't talked about that I think is very interesting is the idea of liquefying solo staker positions, which is quite hard, but novel ideas are coming out around this. So yeah, look forward to that and check out our previous work at this address. Thank you.
Do we have any questions? Accountants in the room?
Thank you so much for the talk. The AVS is very complex. What should EigenLayer do about it? What future research direction should EigenLayer take?
Right. The question is, should it be EigenLayer doing that? Maybe you don't want the provider or like the gateway to this network of services also becoming the arbiter, I guess, of yeah, what risk these services carry. But generally speaking, I would say there's a lot that can be done. The first one is monitoring data-driven, yeah, so all of these observations. I do think things like these liquid baskets make a lot of sense because having decentralized curation over these can be more helpful in, yeah, creating robustness over the types of risks that people go in. As a protocol designer, of course, the risk to me is that some people will be able to enter into AVSs that others people can't, and then the yields become different, and then you have centralization economically because there are some providers that are maybe more trusted to enter into certain AVSs. So I also think this idea of liquefying AVS position is quite powerful as a tool to, yeah, allow widespread access to these yields to everyone.
One more question? Yep.
So with restaking, the increase in exposure, which leads to increased yields, is not only like exposure for the liquid staked asset holder, but also these various protocols. Like if you have, the Ethereum network and most of its liquid ETH is staked in a bunch of other protocols, there's a large slashing event, and you end up burning like ETH that's staked or withdrawing it. If the Ethereum network loses security, what do you think these protocols should do to protect against these negative externalities by people, created by people leveraging up?
Yeah, also a good question. To some extent, I think the means are fairly limited. There is some discussions around enshrining these EigenLayer type of mechanisms so you can control them better. I think so far these ideas are somewhat preliminary and it's not clear that you can internalize that much risk as the protocol anyway. One thing that might be interesting is diversification. So I was talking about the liquid basket of AVSs, that's a diversification for holders, but for protocols, what they might want to diversify on is their own staking provision. So they might not want to be fully secured by just EigenLayer supported restaked commitments, but also by just raw native asset commitments. I know EigenLayer had a post recently on dual staking, which has these different ideas. So in Cosmos, you see that quite a lot of these discussions, at least like between interchain security versus mesh security and combinations thereof. Yeah, so I think we can't really stop it against a permissionless environment, but in my opinion, the protocols who have more value to their users are the more robust ones. And if you can make a claim for this robustness by showing, my mechanism is pretty solid because I have like all these different sources, and so you need to take them all down at the same time to take my protocol down. I think these types of arguments are more convincing to me. Yeah.
Okay, then we'll move on to the panel. So thank you very much, Barnabé.
Thank you.